4 astronauts have just entered a zone where no radio signal reaches. No voice from Houston, no data, no help. If something broke behind the moon, they were completely alone. On the 6th day of the Artemis II mission, NASA made history in a way that most people didn't even notice. The Orion capsule, named Integrity by the astronauts themselves, crossed the far side of the moon and pushed human presence in space beyond any limit ever reached in a planned way. Today, you will see what happened on that dark side, the absolute record of humanity's distance in space, the Earthrise, and an event no one expected. Meteoroids colliding with the moon live, filmed from space. To understand the weight of that day, you need to know one thing. Day 6 was not like the others. In the previous 5 days, astronauts Ry Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen woke up every morning with a huge list of technical tasks. Check equipment, test life support systems, calibrate instruments. It was intense operational work, focused on ensuring that the spacecraft was functioning. But on the 6th day, the mission completely changed its face. At about 30,000 kilometers from the lunar surface, the entire cabin entered scientific mode. The engineers activated the Lunar Targeting Plan, a geological mapping software built specifically for this approach window. It was time to execute everything that had been prepared since the 3rd day of the mission, when Jeremy Hansen and Christina Koch calibrated cameras and trained target identification using augmented reality on the tablets. The list had 35 rocky targets marked on the screen, and the 4 astronauts would have 7 straight hours to cover as much of the lunar surface as possible, taking turns in pairs. This was not exploration out of curiosity. It was the work of orbital geologists, mapping rugged terrain with their own eyes to ensure the safety of the landing missions that are coming. No robotic probe can do this with the same precision. The message that stopped the cabin. Before the observations began, the astronauts received a recording that made the cabin stop. It was the voice of Jim Lovell, astronaut of the Apollo 8 and Apollo 13 missions, who passed away in 2025 at 97 years old. In the recording, he welcomed the crew to his old neighborhood, spoke of the legacy of Apollo 8, and said he was proud to pass the torch to them. Think about the weight of that. The man who orbited the moon in 1968, who survived an explosion on board in 1970, sending a message to the first humans who returned to that region more than 50 years later.
At 1356 Eastern Time of the United States, Orion crossed the mark of 400,171 kilometers of distance from Earth. This number is not random. It was the previous record, established by Apollo 13 in 1970, after an explosion in the service module forced an emergency loop around the moon. That record was born from pure desperation. A catastrophic failure that almost killed 3 men ended up generating unintentionally the greatest distance ever traveled by humans in space. This time, there was no failure. There was no improvisation. At Mission Control in Houston, the confirmation arrived with applause. And most importantly, this was still not the final number. The trajectory of Artemis II has a figure 8 shape, a maneuver explained and planned by the crew. The capsule was still in the middle of its curve. In the following hours, it would continue pushing that limit even further.
Earthset. As Orion approached the moon, something happened that has a psychological impact, difficult to describe with words. Up to that moment, no matter how far the astronauts were from Earth, the planet was still visible through the window. Blue, immense, floating in the darkness. A visual anchor, a safe harbor. But the mass of the moon began to dominate the field of view, and the trajectory started dragging the spacecraft to the side of the satellite. It was then that they experienced what is called Earthset.
the setting of Earth. The geometry of that moment is exact and relentless. Earth does not disappear on the horizon because the planet is rotating. It disappears because the spacecraft itself is physically diving behind the rocky curvature of the moon. A wall of rock was swallowing the entire planet, slowly, until nothing was left. That was the moment when the 4 astronauts realized, I can no longer see my home, and that visual blackout was only the warning of what came next.
At 1844, Orion crossed the radio boundary and entered the loss of signal zone, what NASA calls LOS. The screens at Mission Control in Houston froze. No telemetry line, no oxygen data, no heartbeat, no video. For about 40 minutes, the spacecraft and its 4 crew members were completely isolated from any kind of help. The flight computers assumed 100% control of vital operations. Think about what this means in practice. If any failure occurred in the life support system, a deviation in trajectory, a loss of pressure, anything, the problem would need to be resolved exclusively by the 4 people on board. No engineer's voice could guide them. No Earth-based algorithm could intervene. It is the window of greatest technical and human vulnerability of the entire journey. The silence on Houston's radios confirmed that, at that exact moment, they were at the mercy of the precision of the machines and the vastness of the cosmos.
The 2 most extreme numbers in human space history. It was exactly during this dive into blackout, completely blind to Earth, that the capsule's autonomous systems recorded the 2 most extreme numbers of the entire journey. At 1902, Orion executed the lowest part of the flyby. It passed at only 6,549 kilometers of altitude above the cratered crust of the far side of the moon. A distance that is like crossing the Americas by plane, except in the absolute vacuum of space and far above mountain ranges that never receive direct sunlight. Only 5 minutes later, at 1907, the gravitational curve completed its widest arc. And it was at that second that Orion set the definitive mark. 406,771 kilometers of distance from Earth.
This is the absolute record of human presence in space, the most distant point that any human being has ever reached. And unlike the Apollo 13 record, this was achieved with everything functioning perfectly. Within the planned mathematical margin, in total darkness, behind a planet that is not ours. From that moment on, the inertia generated by the maneuver inverted everything. The capsule reached its maximum limit and began to be thrown back toward Earth. The scientific work on the far side. While the instruments recorded these historic numbers, the 4 astronauts were not just looking out the window. During those 40 minutes without signal, they executed what had been prepared since the first days. As it was impossible to transmit images in real time, they recorded everything in the physical memory of the cameras and dictated geological reports into the cabin's voice recorders. The documented targets included the eastern rim of the South Pole Aitken Basin, one of the largest and oldest impact structures in the solar system, so deep that it exposed internal layers of the moon. Also, the Vavilov crater, the Oriental Basin, with its nearly 960 kilometers in diameter, and other formations that cross the boundary between the near side and the far side. The mission relied our human eyes to capture real differences in color, depth, and texture that automatic cameras simply distort under the extreme lighting of space. The most human moment of Day 6, and it was during this silent flyby that something happened that was not in any flight plan. The crew spotted 2 unnamed craters on the surface of the moon and suggested provisional names for them. The first received the name Integrity, the same name the crew had given to the Orion capsule itself since the beginning of the mission. The second was called Carol, a tribute to the wife of Commander Ry Wiseman, who passed away from cancer in 2020.
In a mission that rewrites history, it was them who chose who would be forever recorded on the surface of the moon.
The return of the signal, the Earthrise, and an eclipse no one expected. At 1925, Orion completed the curve, rounded the edge of the moon, and re-established contact with the ground antennas. The telemetry returned in green. All systems had withstood the blind zone without needing a reboot and without the loss of any data. And at that exact moment, as soon as the windows aligned with the new direction, the crew was granted the privilege of witnessing Earthrise, the rising of Earth. It is the most revered visual event of space exploration. The capsule emerging from the shadows of the far side, and over an arid and lifeless horizon, the entire planet appearing as a fragile sphere of water and clouds. It was exactly this angle that helped transform the environmental awareness of the world in the 1960s during the Apollo 8 mission of Jim Lovell, whose message had sounded that same morning. But the laser communication system, tested and validated on the third day of the mission, proved its full value. All the high-definition videos, the geological reports, and the photos of this rebirth were transmitted to Houston in a matter of seconds. And then, orbital physics still had an even greater spectacle in store. Due to the launch window chosen for Artemis II, the return geometry generated a rare and perfect alignment between Orion, the Moon, and the Sun. The enormous structure of our natural satellite directly blocked the light of the star. The astronauts experienced a solar eclipse in deep space, with the Moon doing the blocking. For 57 minutes, the spacecraft traveled submerged in the cold shadow of the Moon. And since there is no atmosphere to dirty or distort the light, the darkness generated was much deeper and more absolute than any eclipse seen from here on Earth. Astronaut Victor Glover described over the radio what he saw through the spacecraft window: the sun disappearing behind the moon, the corona still visible and bright, forming a halo, and the moon becoming a black sphere suspended in space, with stars and planets visible in the background. The crew took advantage of this perfect dark window to focus the cameras on the solar corona, the outermost atmosphere of the sun, where superheated plasmas at more than 1 million degrees boil under violent magnetic fields. Telescopes on Earth rarely capture these details without noise. Inside Orion, the capsule functioned as a privileged astronomical observatory. The cosmic bombardment live. And then something happened that no one expected. With the sunlight completely blocked by the eclipse, the surface of the moon directly below the capsule plunged into absolute darkness. NASA had instructed the crew to watch for possible impact flashes in that dark window, and that is exactly what happened. The crew went on the radio to report quick, intense, and very clear flashes exploding against the darkened surface of the moon. It was not an instrument error. It was not an optical illusion. They were watching live the violent collision of meteoroids against the lunar surface. Earth has a dense atmosphere that serves as a thermal shield, burning much of the space debris that tries to enter. Those are the shooting stars you see in the sky. The moon does not have that protection. Any piece of rock traveling at thousands of kilometers per hour hits the ground intact, with all its kinetic force preserved. The result is a sudden detonation that, for a fraction of a second, dazzles the shattered rock and creates a light visible from space. Watching this from a front row seat triggers a very serious engineering alert. It proves that building habitats on the lunar surface and placing humans walking on the dust will require the development of robust physical protections. The data captured by Orion will now be used together with images from ground-based telescopes to measure the force of these explosions and improve risk models for future lunar bases. To close the historic day, NASA activated a direct, high-quality video channel linking the spacecraft to the President of the United States and to the agency's Central Command. The 4 astronauts floated in front of the camera, relieved and smiling. Commander Wiseman spoke about seeing from the moon the places he had known on Earth his entire life, now from a completely different perspective. Christina Koch said she was not ready to go back home. Showing the crew healthy, lucid, and navigating far beyond the limits of the Apollo era was the clearest message the Artemis program could send to the world. But the celebration was short-lived. As soon as the camera lights went off, the weight of the checklists immediately returned. The lunar exploration mode was over. Now the laws of inertia begin to drag Orion toward Earth at a speed that increases every minute. From the next day on, the only concern of the mission will be to align the capsule at a millimetric braking angle. The final target is an extremely narrow corridor over the Pacific Ocean, near the coast of San Diego. Any deviation in this trajectory means ricocheting off the atmosphere or burning irreparably during descent.
The spectacle in deep space is over.
Day 6 rewrote the limits of human presence in space, proved that autonomous engineering can keep us alive where no voice reaches, and left 2 names forever recorded on the surface of the moon. Orion turned its back to the moon. Now the mission is only one: get home at the right angle. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next.